In the hedgerow country of Normandy, American bazooka teams had a life expectancy measured in minutes once they revealed their position. Not hours, not days, minutes. Panzer commanders issued specific orders to their machine gunners. The moment you see the flash of a rocket launcher, that position dies before anything else. Every rifle, every tank-mounted weapon, every mortar in range would pivot toward that single point. The infantry squads nearby, the officers, the machine gun nests, all of them became secondary. The two men holding that tube became the most important targets on the entire battlefield. This seems counterintuitive. A bazooka team was just two soldiers, one holding a hollow tube, the other feeding rockets into the back. They carried no more ammunition than a rifleman. They wore the same uniforms, dug the same foxholes, ate the same rations. They were, by every measurable standard, among the least numerous and least well-protected soldiers on the field. And yet German tank crews feared them more than artillery batteries, more than anti-tank guns, more than the fighter bombers circling overhead. There is a reason for this fear, and it has nothing to do with the bazooka being a superweapon. It was in many ways the opposite. The truth buried inside this targeting priority reveals something uncomfortable about how industrialized warfare actually functions, and what happens to the men who carry weapons designed to solve impossible problems. To understand why bazooka teams were marked for immediate death, you first have to understand the problem they were created to solve. In 1942, American military planners faced a strategic nightmare that had been building since the fall of France. German armored doctrine had proven devastatingly effective. Tanks, properly supported by infantry and air power, could break through defensive lines that would have held for months in the previous war. The Blitzkrieg was not a myth. It was an operational reality that had already consumed Poland, France, the Low Countries, and vast stretches of the Soviet Union. The American response was multi-layered: tank destroyers, anti-tank guns, air superiority. But there remained a gap that none of these solutions could fill. What happens when a German tank appears suddenly, at close range, in terrain where no anti-tank gun can be positioned? What happens when infantry finds itself alone, unsupported, facing 30 tons of armored steel grinding toward their position? Before 1942, the answer was simple: they died. Or they ran. Or they died running. The M1 rocket launcher, nicknamed the Bazooka, after a musical instrument popular in radio comedy, was designed to fill this gap. It was radical in concept. For the first time in history, a single infantryman could carry a weapon capable of penetrating tank armor. The physics were elegant: a shaped charge warhead propelled by a rocket motor, requiring no heavy recoil mechanism or artillery carriage. Two men could carry it. One could fire it. The rocket did the rest. The specifications seemed miraculous. The original M1 could penetrate roughly 3 inches of armor plate at effective ranges of around 100 yards. This was enough to defeat the side or rear armor of most German tanks in 1942. A weapon weighing less than 15 pounds, operated by soldiers with minimal specialized training, could theoretically neutralize a machine that cost the Reich thousands of man-hours and irreplaceable resources to produce. Theoretically. The gap between theoretical capability and battlefield reality is where this story turns dark. The bazooka's effective range created its fundamental problem: 100 yards. In some conditions, less. This meant that to engage a tank, the bazooka team had to be close enough to see the faces of the crew if they opened their hatches, close enough to hear the squeal of the tracks, close enough to smell the diesel exhaust, close enough that the tank's machine guns and the supporting infantry could see them clearly, and they had to remain stationary while firing. The launcher required a stable position. The gunner had to acquire the target, estimate range and lead, hold steady, and squeeze the trigger. The loader had to remain directly behind the weapon to insert the rocket and connect the electrical firing wire. This process took seconds, but seconds during which both men were completely exposed and completely still. The backblast was visible. The smoke trail was visible. The flash was visible. Every tank commander learned to watch for that signature. Every supporting infantryman was trained to respond to it. The moment a bazooka revealed itself, the clock started. The team had approximately the time it took for the tank's turret to traverse, or for the hull gunner to adjust his aim, or for the nearest rifleman to acquire them in his sights. Sometimes this was 5 seconds, sometimes 3. Sometimes the tank was already pointed in their direction. The men who carried bazookas understood this arithmetic with terrible clarity. To be effective, they had to accept conditions that were nearly suicidal. The German perspective on bazooka teams evolved through hard experience. In North Africa and Sicily, Wehrmacht and SS units initially encountered American rocket launchers as curiosities. Inaccurate, underpowered, unreliable in the desert heat. Early reports dismissed them as desperation weapons, the kind of thing an army fielded when it lacked proper anti-tank guns. This assessment was not entirely wrong for the M1 and early M1A1 variants, which suffered from electrical problems, accuracy issues, and warheads that sometimes failed to detonate. But by the time American forces landed in Normandy, the weapon had matured. The M9 variant addressed many reliability problems. More importantly, the tactics for its employment had been refined through painful trial and error. Bazooka teams no longer fired at the front of approaching tanks where the armor was thickest. They learned to wait, to let the steel monster pass, to fire at the thinner rear armor, at the engine deck, at the tracks, to position themselves where the tank's weapons could not immediately respond. This made them far more dangerous and far harder to detect until it was too late. For a Panzer IV or Panther crew, the bazooka represented a category of threat that other anti-tank weapons did not. An anti-tank gun could be spotted by its muzzle flash or the dust its crew kicked up while positioning. It was static, heavy, crew-served. It could be marked and avoided or suppressed with high explosive rounds. A tank destroyer announced itself as a vehicle, subject to the same visibility constraints as any armored machine, but a bazooka team could be anywhere. They could be in a hedgerow you had already passed, in a ruined building cellar, in a drainage ditch, in a foxhole dug into a reverse slope. They were functionally invisible until the moment they fired, and by then, the rocket was already in the air. The response to this threat became doctrine. German tank platoons operating in close terrain developed a protocol that prioritized bazooka suppression above almost all other considerations. When a rocket was fired, regardless of whether it hit, every weapon that could engage the launch point would do so immediately and with maximum violence. Machine guns, main guns firing high explosive, coaxial weapons, supporting infantry rifles. The goal was not merely to kill the team that had fired. The goal was to make the cost of firing a bazooka so catastrophic that other teams would hesitate. This worked. American after-action reports from the Norman hedgerows document cases of bazooka teams refusing to fire even at point-blank range, knowing that the act of revealing themselves was likely fatal. The weapon designed to give infantry a fighting chance against armor had created a new calculus of terror. There is a quality of fear specific to the bazooka team's position that other infantrymen did not experience in the same way. The rifleman could shoot and move, relying on the chaos of battle to obscure his individual contribution to the enemy's casualties. The machine gunner, though targeted for suppression, operated as part of a larger position with supporting elements and could displace between bursts. The mortar crew worked from defilade, invisible to the enemy they were killing. The bazooka team had none of these protections. Their weapon system was inherently self-revealing. Every shot they fired was essentially a signed confession of their exact location. And unlike artillery or airstrikes, they could not kill from a safe distance. They had to be close enough that the enemy could respond before they could move. Survivors of these teams, and there were not many who survived prolonged combat in this role, describe a particular kind of psychological preparation. They knew in a concrete and personal way that effectiveness meant death. The better they were at their job, the shorter their careers. A team that destroyed multiple tanks was a team that had fired multiple times, each firing announcing their position to an enemy growing increasingly desperate to kill them. Some teams developed elaborate techniques to mitigate this, firing from positions with pre-planned escape routes, having other soldiers provide covering fire during the vulnerable moments after launch, constructing false positions with decoys to draw the inevitable retaliation away from the actual team. These methods helped at the margins. They did not change the fundamental equation. The German infantry supporting armored units in Normandy developed their own terrible expertise in hunting these teams. They learned to watch for the displacement after a shot, to anticipate where a team might move, to set up ambush positions along likely withdrawal routes. Tank-infantry cooperation in the Wehrmacht and SS emphasized the infantry's role in protecting armor from close-range threats, and bazooka teams were the embodiment of that threat. There are recorded instances of German infantry assaulting American positions with the specific objective of eliminating known bazooka positions, accepting significant casualties to achieve this single goal. From their perspective, this was rational. A single bazooka team could destroy vehicles worth more than a platoon of infantry in replacement cost and combat power. Spending lives to eliminate that capability made cold strategic sense. The Americans learned to anticipate this. Bazooka positions became traps, surrounded by riflemen and automatic weapons, waiting for the assault they knew would come. The weapon became bait as much as it was a tank killer. This layered defensive adaptation speaks to how seriously both sides took the threat these two-man teams represented. What is rarely discussed in conventional histories is the selection process that emerged informally for bazooka teams. Officially, any trained soldier could be assigned to carry the launcher or serve as its loader. In practice, units developed their own internal logic for who ended up with this duty. Sometimes it was the new replacements assigned to the dangerous job because they lacked the seniority or relationships to avoid it. Sometimes it was volunteers, men with particular motivations, fatalism, aggression, something to prove, reasons they rarely articulated. Sometimes it was the unlucky, soldiers who happened to be standing in the wrong place when the weapon needed a carrier. The men who served in this role for extended periods often exhibited a psychological distance from their peers. Not coldness exactly, but a removal, an awareness that their expected timeline was different. They planned less, they wrote fewer letters, they formed fewer attachments. This was not universal, but it was common enough to be remarked upon by chaplains and medical officers in confidential reports. The weight of the weapon itself became symbolic. The launcher was awkward, roughly 5 feet long, difficult to carry through dense terrain. The rockets were bulky and sensitive to moisture and impact. A fully loaded team carried perhaps 5 or 6 rounds, enough for a few engagements if they survived that long. Every step with that equipment was a reminder of what awaited at the destination. Veterans described the particular exhaustion of carrying hope for an entire platoon. When tanks appeared, every eye turned to the bazooka team. The expectation was physical, a pressure that could be felt across the battlefield. Other soldiers looked at these men the way passengers on a sinking ship look at the lifeboat crew, with desperation, with hope they tried to conceal, with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite resentment. The weapon continued to evolve throughout the war. By late 1944, the improved M20 Super Bazooka was in development, offering greater penetration to deal with heavier German armor. But the fundamental problem remained unsolved. No redesign could change the physics of rocket flight. No improvement in warhead technology could alter the requirement to fire from close range. No tactical innovation could eliminate the visibility of the backblast. The bazooka worked. That was never in question. It gave infantry a capability they desperately needed. Thousands of German tanks, assault guns, and vehicles were destroyed or damaged by this weapon and its derivatives. The principle it established, man-portable, rocket-propelled anti-tank systems, remains central to infantry doctrine worldwide. But effectiveness is not the same as mercy, and capability is not the same as safety. After the war ended, the bazooka teams who survived did not speak often of their service in this role. There were no associations specifically for them, no reunions of the men who had carried the tube. They blended back into the general mass of infantry veterans, their particular experience unmarked and largely unrecorded. Occasionally, in oral histories collected decades later, one of these survivors would describe the feeling of holding that weapon, of knowing what it meant to fire it. They spoke of the weight, which was not heavy in absolute terms but became unbearable in psychological ones. They spoke of the sound of tanks, how they learned to identify individual models by the pitch of their engines and the rhythm of their tracks. They spoke of waiting, which was the worst part, worse than the firing, worse than the running, worse than the aftermath. Some of them declined to fire when they should have. They admitted this quietly, without making excuses. They had looked at the geometry, understood what would happen, and chosen not to reveal themselves. Men died because of these decisions. Tanks rolled past that should have been burning. They lived with this knowledge for the rest of their lives, understanding that the alternative was not living at all. Others fired every time, accepting the consequences, and were eventually killed or wounded so severely they could no longer serve. These men were often recommended for decorations that described their actions as courage. Perhaps that word applies. Perhaps there is a better word for doing something you know will likely kill you over and over because the weapon you carry cannot work any other way. The bazooka was a solution to an impossible problem. It turned infantrymen into tank killers. It also turned them into priority targets, marked for death by an enemy that understood exactly how dangerous they were. The weapon's effectiveness was inseparable from its cost. There was no version of this technology that did not paint a target on its operators. History remembers the capability. The men who carried that capability mostly left no monuments. They are buried alongside riflemen and machine gunners and medics, their headstones making no distinction. The specific fear they lived with, the particular mathematics of their survival odds, the understanding they reached about what their weapon demanded, all of this exists now only in fading documents, aging recordings, and the silence of those who chose never to speak of it at all. In the decades since, military technology has advanced beyond recognition. Guided missiles, thermal sights, weapons that can destroy armor from miles away. But somewhere in every modern infantry manual, there remains an echo of those hedgerow teams. The doctrine still acknowledges the fundamental truth they discovered in blood, that being capable of killing tanks means being capable of dying for it. That silence is perhaps the most honest memorial they could have chosen.